one of Russia's top generals in Syria and Ukraine has been put out to pasture, retired to a do-nothing job. But with a resume like his, it's honestly a surprise that it took this long. Just what is the fate of Russia's most incompetent general? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit that subscribe. Let's talk about it. Now, this couldn't have happened to a worse person. This is, of course, Colonel General Alexander Lapin has been dismissed from military service, according to Russian state media. And the general, as the Kiev Independent points out, has been associated with battlefield setbacks since 2022. But I would argue, actually, he's been responsible for setbacks since before then. Alexander Lapin, for example, was actually a member of the general staff of Ukraine of Russia for nearly 20 years. But what I thought was most interesting is that he actually was the chief of staff of the Russian forces in Syria in 2017, promoted to colonel general in 2019, and was head of the and then was later head of the Combined Arms Academy, training senior Russian officers. So what I think is interesting, he was also in 2018, 2019, the commander of Russian group of forces in Syria. Now, this is telling because it's pretty controversial, right? Lapin really, so the Russian intervention in Syria was meant to shore up the Assad regime. And the Assad regime, well, was in pretty bad shape, but its enemies were also like ragtag militias. And so the fact that Russia was willing to commit real combat troops to fight in Syria was really enough to sort of turn the tide in favor of Assad, especially given that the Assad government was still at its core kind of functional, right? There were all the skeleton of a government was still there. And one of the things that the U.S. has learned the hard way is that shoring up a legitimate government can actually be really an effective counterinsurgency strategy because, again, what you have is all the existing infrastructure that people already know and trust, that's already locally established, right? That's aligned with the culture that at some point was governing this group of people effectively. And so by resourcing it, it can be really effective. And that's kind of what it was, right? So again, so you didn't have to be all that competent. You just had to go in and be like, listen, we're the Russians. We have fighter aircraft. We have large scale combat troops. We have satellite intelligence. Just tell us what you guys need, and we'll try to help your forces out. And that was effective. It allowed the Assad regime to establish control over the majority of Syria. There's a problem, though. And that problem is the fact that for all of his efforts, remember, the Assad regime was ultimately so corrupt and brittle, right? It was like saying, hey, it's the difference between helping out a regime that is skeletal but alive and a regime that is literally a skeleton. And that, I think, is the issue that Russia kind of ran into, is that Lapin was supposed to intervene, shore up the Syrian regime, and then sort of leave a victor now that Assad was stable and strengthened. The problem is that we now know Assad was never really that strong. He was always on shaky legs. And without considerable Russian support, even after years of Russian bankrolling him, he essentially fell flat on his face and got rolled back by a Western-backed Syrian government. Admittedly, one headed by a terrorist who killed American troops, but I guess that's a fine thing to do now. But Lapin, of course, went from failure to failure, right? In 2022, he was in Russia's Central Military District, commanding Russian troops in Kharkiv in September 2022, which you might recall was the site of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, where essentially their defenses just collapsed wholesale, and Ukrainians retook multiple cities. It was, in fact, the most stunning success that the Ukrainians have had in the entire war in terms of retaking territory. It was really, other than the Battle of Kiev, probably the most strategic advantage that the Ukrainians had. Total Russian collapse, and he was the #1 guy for that. And of course, Putin was pretty mad, and so he said, listen, Lapin, we're going to have you do something that's still military, but something that's nothing to worry about, something that even an idiot could get right. We are going to have you just secure the Russian border region in Kursk. They're the Ukrainians. They're fighting in the east. They have no military. Just do Kursk, right? Just sit there and have some conscripts sit in some bunkers. You'll be fine. Well, they weren't fine. Spoiler alert. The Ukrainians pushed into Kursk, deep into Kursk. And the Wall Street Journal scooped that actually gaps in Russian defenses under Lapin let Ukraine advance. They may have even encouraged Ukraine in some ways to enter Kursk because those defenses were so porous and poorly constructed. Now, as they point out, as we all know, Russia retook Kursk, but at a tremendous cost, right? They needed to go to the North Koreans with their hat in their hand and say, please help us with troops. And about 80,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. So finally, Lapin has been told, listen, just get out of here, man. Unnamed sources from the matter said Lapin is going to serve in his retirement as assistant to the head of Tatarstan, Rustam Minakhanov. So what I want to point out is a couple of things. First off, the fact is that, Putin is an autocrat, and he definitely kills people who are disloyal. But Lapin, being a loyal idiot, is actually a recipe for long-term survival in an autocratic regime. In fact, being an idiot is actually a pretty good survival mechanism because Lapin's never going to organize a meaningful political resistance to Putin. He's never going to, stage a kind of Wagner group mutiny. He's never going to even run a social media account that talks about military affairs. He's never going to become a mill blogger. He doesn't have the competence to do these things, and reputationally, he's essentially been destroyed. So he's going to go retire off to a do-nothing post where he'll simply play out the rest of his days. He probably won't even be expected to show up. But the real thing to tell here is that this is still, despite his failures, or maybe evidenced by his failures, a member of Putin's inner circle. This is someone who, again, you have to understand that in 2017, the Russian military's intervention in Syria was the single largest and most daring Russian power projection operation that Putin had ever undertaken. Every other Russian operation, their annexing of Crimea, their annexing of the Donbas, their invasion of Georgia, those operations were all projected from Russian land. They could literally drive the Russian military could just drive to the invasion point. In Syria, they were expected to go over countries, some of which were hostile, land in Syria, establish forward operating bases, integrate with a foreign military, and then aid that foreign military in their campaign. And so the thing that you should take away is that this was someone who Putin did trust to an extreme degree. And he failed a lot, but clearly his loyalty to Putin, his willingness to do the dictator's bidding, was beyond reproach. And the fact that he is being kicked to the curb may be a sign that either Putin is starting to realize that his inner circle is looking smaller and smaller and thinner, right? He may be asking himself, hey, why are there so few competent people around me? As we've discussed, this is not a weird decision in and of itself, but it's weird that it comes just days after his other senior political advisor also got canned. This may be part of a larger Putin inner circle like collapse, and it could be Putin becoming paranoid or becoming more strident, looking closer for signs of disloyalty, right? He says, I want a smaller and smaller inner circle. Super common. I mean, Putin's a man in his 70s. He could be becoming more paranoid, probably becoming more rigid in his thinking. I mean, just being an old man, it just makes you kooky. And this isn't me being like they just get a little kooky. There's actually a lot of science behind the aging brain and its ability to learn, integrate, and adapt to new ideas. And this isn't me being like, oh, Putin's going to abandon the war soon. But this is me saying, hey, every time Putin does this kind of stuff, he does make an enemy. And it may even be a simple case of Lapin won't say anything. If somebody goes in and tells Putin that I think it's time for him to retire and get put out to pasture in rural Russia as well. That sort of thing is certainly possible. And the more oligarchs, the more resentful generals, the more people are floating around Russia with real power and real loyalty and real grudges against Putin, the more likely we're going to see this kind of turning of the tide. Thank you guys for watching, and be sure to hit the subscribe button. But if you want to help Ukrainian units who are in the thick of the fight right now, you can go over to the link in the description and help Ukraine Aid Ops raise funds for Ukraine's elite units who are holding the line in Kramatorsk. Whether it's drones, batteries, eco-flows, whatever these units need, we try to get it to them. The 93rd, the 25th Azov, Lyut, all units that I've personally met and are some of the best in the Ukrainian military are holding the line in Kramatorsk, and we have a huge funding goal, $300,000, but we got help. An anonymous donor, they've pledged dollar for dollar to match every donation you guys make. So check the link in the description, and by the way, it's tax deductible. It's a US 501c3. So thanks to our Colonel tier members over on combatvetnews.com, AL90, James Porsche, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, William Alex, Henry Russier, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you. Appreciate you so much. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.